I'm Jenny.
And I am Benj, and we're here again for another interesting episode as we welcome you all to
the show where we look at the food of the past and the present
to get a glimpse of the plate of the future.
Hello, dear listeners! Welcome to another episode of the Future Plate Podcast.
Yes, good evening guys. Familiar na ba kayo sa concept ng Rice Self-Sufficiency?
Mukhang na-mention na din natin yan sa previous episodes. From what I remember, it is the ability of a country or community to meet its own food needs through its own local rice production in this case. Kung sa rice self-sufficiency, di ba?
Wow, very good. 1 point yan sa recitation natin for today. Pero anyway, as you mentioned, Jenny, no, nahapyawan na rin natin yan sa ating food sovereignty episode. Kaya naman, in-invite muli natin ang ating guest from last time para pag-usapan itong topic ng rice self-sufficiency.
Ayan, kasi napakabigate, napaka-importante ng topic, in demand. So, pinabalik talaga natin sino nga ba naman tayo at pinaunlakan niya tayo sa ating imbitasyon para sa topic na ito. So, nagbabalik ang taong sumulat ng papel tungkol dito. Ayan.
Ayan, correct. So, ano nga ba yung papel na yun? This paper was entitled Freedom from the Corporate Food Regime, Food Sovereignty, and the Struggle for Rice Self-Sufficiency in the Philippines. So, para po sa the rest ng introduction dito sa ating guest, balikan nyo na lang po yung ating nakaraang episode. And with that, let's all welcome Mr. Mel Yan again to the show. Good evening, Mel.
Good evening, Benj and Jen. Good afternoon sa ating dalawa na nandito sa other side of the world. So, and hello to our listeners. It's nice to be back here and it's nice to talk to you again about food sovereignty and its implications to rice self-sufficiency.
Okay. So, sige Mel, dumiretso na tayo, di ba? Dahil parang sinaing, mainit. Masarap pag mainit. Parang bagong lutong sinaing. Sige. So, sige. From you, dahil ikaw ang expert dito, sumulat ka ng papel. So, ano nga ba ang rice self-sufficiency?
Yeah, I think na-capture mo naman, Jen, yung definition na sinabi mo kanina. Rice self-sufficiency, of course, is our ability to be able to domestically produce and meet the quantity requirements of the country for rice. Just to give a background for those who are not familiar, currently the Philippines is about 80% rice self-sufficient. This means that 20%, at least 20% of our rice consumption needs are met through imports. Although, generally, hindi naman tayo nagkukulang sa bigas, no? Based on mga reports ng ating government. Kasi dahil nga rice is very important to our diet, given na yun yung ating staple food, meron naman tayong tinatawag na buffer stocks. So nagsa-stockpiling ang government to ensure na merong supply ng bigas sa market. And in fact, this parang stockpiling natin sa government was important, especially during the pandemic. And we know that food prices were affected during the pandemic. But so far, there were reports and analysis that were made that rice was relatively a bit stable during the pandemic, given that really had enough supply kasi may stockpiling tayo ng rice. And then at the same time, if you look at also, sabi ko kay Benj kanina, the current Philippine Development Plan, in terms of the plan for food security of this current administration, one of the key things there is to ensure talaga na meron tayong supply ng rice while increasing productivity. Pero yun nga, rice self-sufficiency technically means na supposedly 100% kaya natin i-meet yung ating rice consumption requirements.
Okay, thank you, Mel. So at least kahit hindi man tayo nasa 100, well, medyo maganda na rin yung 80. At least we're not that dependent. I actually thought that it was a lot lower than what you mentioned, no? But medyo yung ating tanong, medyo broad to. Pero based on the findings of your paper, nung sa Freedom from the Corporate Food Regime, Food Sovereignty, and the Struggle for Rice Self-Sufficiency in the Philippines, how can we achieve this state of maybe 100% rice self-sufficiency? Medyo oversimplification, pero maybe just points or the most important points that you found out from your research.
Yeah. I think that it's very important siguro that there's a deliberate goal in terms of achieving that. And that's very important in terms siguro of our food policy. Kasi if we don't have a goal on rice self-sufficiency, then yung nangyayari, which happened in the previous administration, is that we then sort of become dependent also on the global market, and we don't mind if the 80% goes lower. So a little bit of history, Bench and Jen, kahit ang Philippines ay signatory ng World Trade Organization during the Ramos time, there was a specific imposition of quantitative restrictions, particularly for rice. Dahil nga rice is very, di ba, political, and it's aside from its socio-cultural significance kasi, di ba, 3 times a day naman tayong kumakain ng kanin. And of course, historical importance, meron tayong Banawe rice terraces. At the same time, yung ating mga kakanin that we call Filipino native delicacies, a lot of them are made of rice. And that's very indigenous to the Philippines. At the same time, rice is also an indicator of social and political stability in the country, di ba? Kung mura ang bigas, people will say, oy, medyo stable yung economy ng Philippines. Kaya ginagamit siya na platform ng mga politiko, di ba? Well, if you recall in the last election, there was a really parang positive impact of Marcos promising 20 pesos per kilogram rice, di ba? So, and of course, and it was not just Marcos Jr. that did that. There were like a lot of local and even national politicians that was the topic. No? So rice is very important to us Filipinos. And dahil sa importance niya, nag-impose tayo ng quantitative restrictions even when we signed the WTO because we wanted to try to be self-sufficient. Because if the Philippines is rice self-sufficient, if may mabibigay na bigas, then it sort of gives a perspective na, oy, medyo stable, maganda tong gobyerno na to kasi napapakain nila tayo. And that quantitative restriction has been there in the succeeding administration up until the Pinoy administration. So during the Duterte administration, particularly in 2018, that's when the rice tariffication law was passed. So what that means is that the Philippines is technically now open for rice imports. More entry. So parang naging unlimited entry na yung rice imports with the intention also of eventually reducing tariffs over time as part of the multilateral policies of the World Trade Organization. So if that is the agenda of our food system, then the entry of all these cheaper imports, right, will eventually kill your rice industry. And of course, your farmers naman, when these imports start coming in and they cannot compete with it, the potential implications, hindi na lang ako magpapalay. I might just use the land for something else, or I might sell it na lang to developers who will create a subdivision in our emerging economy sa aming town ngayon, for example. So, right? And by that time, when your rice fields are gone because they've converted it, right? Then the next time you wanted to become rice self-sufficient, then there is probably lack of land already and probably lack of farmers who will do rice self-sufficiency. Although, of course, I cannot say naman with finality na kulang, di ba? I mean, if you look at, again, the Philippine Development Plan, it says that there's so many idle lands also in the Philippines that can still be used for agriculture. Pero yun lang, I think it begins siguro, Bench and Jen, with a deliberate sort of stance to defend a rice self-sufficiency agenda. And then, of course, if that's a clear policy, then how do we achieve that? Then, of course, greater support for our farmers and our production and the entire food value chain siguro in our country. No, hindi lang yung pagtatanim. Kasi a lot of in the study that I did, a lot of our rice farmers are actually getting the least amount from the entire cost of rice. Diba? I mean, paddy rice, for example, it's only 7 pesos. And then you buy your rice at what? 40, 60 pesos. And if you look at also in terms of cost, the rate of increase in terms of retail price of rice is actually faster than the rate of increase of the farm gate price of rice as well. And of course, a lot of your farmers are just farmers, diba? I remember back in the Pinoy administration, the aim was supposedly to empower them to be able to mill their own rice and all of that. Pero ngayon, hindi. farm lang talaga. And then there are traders and millers in between and all of that. So that's another sort of factor to consider, a change, for example, in the entire system to support not just the upstream, but also the downstream part of the system. Because ultimately, rice self-sufficiency also, we need to consider that there's a distribution component of that, right? Kasi minsan, merong supply, pero yung tanong, nadi-distribute ba properly? Of course, ayun na naman tayo sa mga reports of hoarding para mas maging mahal yung rice. And that happened, in the past in several times. So tulad din yan na accusation ngayon sa mga hoarding natin, kaya nagkaroon ng crisis din sa onion the past few weeks.
Okay. So, parang sabi mo nga, paulit-ulit na nangyayari siya. So, since na-mention mo naman na, okay, yung rice ay parang parang yardstick natin siya, metric natin siya kung ano yung ating estado ng ekonomiya and everything, and yet, nauulit-ulit siya. Pero, ano yung pinaka-punot dulo, parang main challenges? Bakit paulit-ulit natin siyang na-experience? Itong hindi natin ma-achieve yung 100% rice self-sufficiency.
I think yung punot dulo nito is over time, there's really a reduction in terms of public support for agriculture. Although, if you notice naman the operational budget of the DA, the Department of Agriculture in the Philippines, at least for 2021, rice is still the number one, no? And dahil yan sa rice tarification law. Kasi supposedly, di ba, merong, may yung mga tariffs gagamitin to support your rice farmers and all of that. So, it's really the lack of support and again, prioritization for agriculture and prioritization in terms of us, producing more food for ourselves, making it more available and at the same time making it more accessible in the country, right? Kaya kung dahil reduce na yung ating support for agriculture over time, it's just so funny when we were younger, Jen and Bench, naalala nyo, we always say the Philippines is an agricultural country. But now if you look at now if you look at the industries, we're actually a service sector driven economy already. And that sort of dwindling support or public investment for agriculture is the reason why we always go back and forth in the process. Kasi hindi natin napagtutuunan ng pansin ulit yung agriculture sector. So yun nga, it's just paulit-ulit lang siya na minsan, okay, nag-depend na lang tayo sa imports and all of that. Then we know that rice imports and the world market is very volatile, di ba? Volatile in the sense that, of course, cost of imports is affected by fuel and we know all the fuel problems like, the Ukraine-Russia war, for example, and all of that. And then supply also in the world market is very volatile during the pandemic. For example, at the start of 2020, Vietnam suddenly said, wait, mag-stop ako ng export kasi ano ba tong pandemic na to? Baka magutom kami. Pero at that time, Vietnam had actually enough supply domestically and enough supply supposedly for export. But they said, mag-export restriction muna tayo. Diba? So it's a very volatile market at the global level. So ayun naman, pag nagkakaproblema na naman tayo with food self-sufficiency, balik na naman ulit tayo sa, dapat maging self-sufficient na naman tayo, increase na naman natin yung support for agriculture and all of that. And then we go back again towards, the longer route. Imbes na we're there, bumalik tayo, tapos babalik na naman in all of it. So paulit-ulit. And that was clearly seen, if you ask me, and this is not just part of the research that I wrote, but also if you look at it now, di ba? Pinoy administration, very strong food staple self-sufficiency program because na, if you look at that document created by that admin, they said they recognize that, the world market is very unstable, very volatile. And then you look at the rice tarification law justification of the Duterte administration saying, hindi, dapat mag-comply tayo sa World Trade Organization. Na dapat, we open ourselves to rice imports and all of that. And yung ating mga farmers, sabi ng isang senator, ay, dapat maging competitive. So, kaya fundingan natin sila to be more competitive. And which sort of implies also na mag-export na lang sila and all of that. Let the world feed them. Ayan. But then, of course, the pandemic happened and nakita natin yung effect. It threatens pala the rice supply, no? And all of that. Now, you have the current administration, the Marcos administration, saying na we have to strive to be food self-sufficient. And it should be the agriculture sector that should drive the Philippine economy and the Philippine growth. If you go to the website of the DA, where the current president sits as the acting PA Secretary. So, ayan. So you notice the pabago-bagong stance natin on rice self-sufficiency. So you move forward and you move back. And then you realize, wait, mali, move forward again. Ay, medyo may problema, move back again and all. But of course, it's not just about outcomes, guys. There's also politics involved in this process. It also sometimes depends also on who the lawmakers are and what are the priorities and who's the ruling sort of political power in the country at this time and what is their stance towards rice self-sufficiency and rice trade. So, yun. So it's a very sort of complex process, but I hope that analysis, at least of our self-sufficiency policy, particularly rice self-sufficiency policy, kind of gives us an idea on bakit hindi tayo makamove forward over the years.
Thank you, Mel, for that donation. Na talagang urong-sulong pala, one of the reasons why, based on what you said, is because yun nga, if administrations change, nag-change yung priorities nila, or kung sino naman yung gabinete nila at iba yung direction na gustong tahakin, then they could actually override whatever policies are in place. And sadly, even if there are infrastructures, say, that have been built up in the past 6 years or so ng isang term, then biglang the other way around. So given all of these challenges, yes, food is political. Dito sa current state natin, current admin, yung estado ng mundo and all that, how feasible do you think it is to attain rice self-sufficiency now sa atin?
For me, Ben, siguro, it's not, I think, a question of feasibility, but a question of need. Given, again, that it's very volatile now, the world market, right? We don't know when the Ukraine-Russia war will end, for example. We don't know when another global pandemic will happen, right? Which can then affect, mobility of commodities and even decisions of exporting countries, food exporting countries to continue exporting, right? Of course, at the end of the day, sabi nga ni, I'm not so sure if it's Bongbong Marcos or Amy Marcos that said na at the end of the day, yung mga exporting countries na yun, unahin naman nila yung mga citizens nila, which is true, which happened to Vietnam early 2020 at the start of the lockdowns. With that, I think there's a greater sort of need now to really work towards rice self-sufficiency. So it's not a matter of feasibility, I guess, but a matter of need. In terms naman of feasibility, we have achieved rice self-sufficiency in the past because there was attention and deliberate government and public support towards rice self-sufficiency. So it's very feasible, bench, so long as we are deliberately clear that that's the goal and that there will be enough resources to work towards rice self-sufficiency and, of course, improving the entire value chain sa country. That includes distribution of rice from like key producing regions, for example. And for me, there's probably also greater incentive since I'm talking about food sovereignty as well and the value that food sovereignty gives to smallholder farmers. There's also an incentive to sort of look into and invest into certain small rice productions also within particular islands, cities, or provinces. For example, in Cebu, you wouldn't think we have rice there, but we do. There's this particular town called Argao that has, a certain small holdings na nagtatanim ng palay. And other areas as well can do that. And of course, I mentioned that there is in part of the Philippine Development Plan, sana mangyari, is that the government really encouraging people to use idle lands for agriculture. And in fact, they plan to increase taxes for idle land to encourage people to utilize that land for agricultural purposes as well. And of course, I guess very crucial since we talk about food sovereignty is also the protection as well of the land, that we have in the Philippines, our farmlands, the protection of our farmers and lands from being converted as well. And I guess that's part of the strategy if we want to have deliberate rice self-sufficiency, no? Kasi paano ka naman naman maging rice self-sufficient kung wala ka ng lupang pagtataniman kasi na-convert na lahat to subdivisions. So, ayan, yun yung another thing. So, if you ask me, is it feasible? It is feasible. If you ask me, how long can we achieve rice self-sufficiency? I wouldn't know because that's part of, it really depends on how much effort we need to be able to achieve that. But more importantly, siguro, Benj, it's, do we need to be rice self-sufficient? Given all the external shocks that we have encountered over the last few months and years, we have to.
Yan, klarong-klaro. We have to. We have to, o diba? So, given na ganun yun na yung parang statement natin dito. Ito na yung parang sa pag-aaral mo nga, Mel, is kailangan, at saka na-emphasize na nga siya nitong war, nitong pandemic, di ba? Ano pa ba yung susunod? Ayan na din yung climate change. Kanina, bago tayo magsimula ng official recording, medyo na-mention din natin yan. Hello, climate change, di ba? So, parang against, yung favor ng farmers kasi yung mga nangyayari. Diba? So, hindi naman sa nagpapaka-dystopian and pessimistic tayo, pero pahirap kasi ng pahirap diba? Parang hindi favorable sa kanila. But is it reason na ipaubayan na lang natin sa iba yung pag-produce? Kasi paano naman tayo? I mean, okay, tayo Mel, wala tayo sa Pilipinas. Pero paano yung Pilipinas? Paano mga Pilipino na nasa Pilipinas? Diba?
Exactly.
So, given na ganyan, hindi naman po pwede na, hindi naman to nakasalalay lang sa mga farmers o sa ilang tao lamang. So ano yung mga role, ano yung magagawa ng different sectors? Sino ba yung may mga pinakamalaking impact para talaga matulungan at ma-achieve itong rice self-sufficiency?
Okay, so first is really the government, in terms of the support that they give and the protection that they give to rice farmers and the support that they need to give to rice farmers as well. And we also see, I guess, the importance of social enterprises in between that are selling rice from the farmers. So we know of like certain social enterprises that are already milling rice, at a fair price for the farmers, and then at the same time distributing the rice as well. So the one in between, the connection between the farmers and the consumers, it's important that this one, and usually this is the private sector, it is important that they also treat farmers fairly and treat consumers fairly. So it is the fair trade sort of process that the private sector in between needs to do. Kasi, of course, as much as possible, we would want the rice farmers not to be the one selling the rice to the consumers, but sometimes that's a bit difficult for them. It's possible, but it's a bit difficult. So there's a lot of capability building, and most of them want to really just focus on agriculture, right? So it's important that whoever is the link between your farmers and consumers, they're the ones that ensure that there's a fair trading for your farmers and consumers, right? And I think crucial here in terms of government support for the farmers, and at the same time, fair trade in between farmers and consumers, some perspective as much as possible also in terms of shortening your value chain. And shortening the value chain, again, means that as much as possible, there are already like farmers cooperatives that are existing right now and have some form of training in terms of business transactions. Maybe sila pwede nating i-empower, for example, in terms of milling, the rice and all of that. Para after that, then it's sold na to consumers, di ba? So, mas shorten ang ating value chain. Kasi the longer the value chain is, so imagine from your farmers, right? Your traders buys your paddies, and then the paddies need to be milled. Iba na naman yon. And then after the milling, of course, you need to pack it, you need to do wholesale, then you need to do retail, and that's when it arrives in our plate, Bench and Jen, and it's transformed into our only rice while eating lechon manok. So it's a very long process. Kaya again, your farmers are at the losing end in terms of the income that they generate from the entire rice value chain. So that part again siguro requires again both fair trade, social enterprises, fair trade, private sector in between, plus the support of your government for for infrastructure and support of your government as well for your farmers. Kasi hopefully when some of the farmers kasi din, and this is based on on-ground experiences, di ba? They get their credit, their parang capital from your millers, for example, di ba? So if they get that from their millers, they have no choice but to sell it to them, or they get it from traders, right? Kasi walang credit na makukuha from government. So ending is that they are forced to sell it at really cheap price, for example. So ayan, so and that creates a disruption in the entire value chain at some point, in the sense that your farmers sometimes get this na disincentivize sila to be able to continue farming rice. So basically all sectors should be involved in this process, especially government.
Mel, singit ko lang ha, naisip ko lang. Kasi when you say government support, di ba? Parang lately din kasi maingay yung na mechanized, or parang yun, na i-level up natin in terms of ganito nga na pagpaproduce. Pero ikaw, do you have any comments about that? Kasi syempre, if we talk about sustainability and effects on the environment and long-term effects on soil health and everything, meron yung epekto, di ba? And ultimately, that will have an effect on the rice self-sufficiency.
That, I guess, is my answer for the last question that you're supposed to ask. I know this is the interim towards that last question, Jen, no? But that is supposed to be my answer to the last question, at least in my
Pinaunahan kita.
In terms of what is the implication of rice self-sufficiency to our future plate, right? And the implication is that, well, twofold. First one is that being rice self-sufficient is the way to go to reduce food miles in the Philippines. Because your alternative staple, for example, bread, especially yung sa mga nagsasabing, hindi na ako mag-rice kasi gusto kong pumayat. We don't produce wheat in the Philippines, and all our wheat are imported. So, the impact of your food miles and your carbon footprint in terms of eating rice, because it's indigenous and we produce that, reduces, that footprint, at least on that aspect. And then the second thing siguro is that your farmers have historically known how to produce rice in ecological ways or ecologically sound ways. In fact, a lot of the seeds that are patented on rice, pinatent na lang yon ng ibang mga corporations or organizations dyan. But the traditional knowledge of that was really from farmers, di ba? Try this variety, try this technique, and all of that. So that is something that we sort of need to harness. I mean, look at our Banawe rice terraces, di ba? It's the ponding technique was a way for our rice to be adaptive and responsive to extreme weather events. And that has been there ever since, di ba? So for me, we need to build on those traditional knowledge, Chen and Bench. And at the same time also, I'm not saying naman that technology shouldn't be used. Kasi unfortunately, we are already in the middle of the climate emergency. Diba? It's not that climate change is nearing. No, it's here, right? And so because it's here, then part of the adaptation mechanisms that we need to do are technologies that are needed to make agriculture more resilient. And that is climate adaptive varieties, for example, of rice and techniques. But in light of food sovereignty, siguro, Jen and Bench, it's important again that we need to know who owns this technology, who owns the seed varieties, right? And the idea, and that's why government, again, I always go back to government's important role, is that if government is the one that owns and develops this, seed varieties and these more ecologically sound techniques to make sure our rice fields are adapted to climate change, then it's a publicly owned thing. Then it becomes more accessible to your farmers. And I have hope naman, Jen and Bench, that climate change is really, at least for the next 5 years of this current administration, climate change, climate mitigation mitigation, adaptation, and climate adaptive agriculture is at the forefront naman of the food policy of the current administration. So again, that's a good start in terms of looking at the implications of rice self-sufficiency to our future plate. So in other words, pwedeng maging rice self-sufficient while at the same time maging environmentally sound. We just need to tap on indigenous knowledge, that's number one, coupled with publicly owned climate adaptive technologies.
Tahimik tayo, Benj. Wow, wala na.
Okay lang. Yeah, kasi naisip ko din, guys, na I think the relevance of food sovereignty, although it's a very contentious term and concept, the relevance of food sovereignty for me, and both critics and advocates agree most of the time, ang relevance niya is on the environmental part, on sustainability, on the fact that, we need to sustain our environment, we need to be, climate change is already here. We can still try to mitigate it, but we can try to be adaptive to climate change. That's, I guess, the relevance of this whole concept of rice self-sufficiency. Kasi kung gusto mo namang maging rice self-sufficient, dapat it's sustaining also, di ba? Kasi hindi ka magiging sufficient kung one-time, big-time sufficiency, tapos sinira mo na lahat, then next year, wala na, di ba? It does not make sense. So for me, rice self-sufficiency automatically brings with it environmental sustainability. So that's why we really need to consider how we're producing as well. And indigenous practices have been there in the history of the Philippines as a rice-producing and rice-eating nation, has already been there to make sure that our agriculture is protected from extreme weather events, which we have had in the past. It's just that currently, mas napaparami lang sila and mas nagiging more extreme. So that's where, I guess, technologies as well, so long as it can be equitably accessed, especially among poor farmers, is very crucial.
So, all right, thank you, Mel, for that explanation. So, ang dami ko na namang napulot as usual. But again, based on your summaries, ang napulot ko talaga is, yes, primary yung government support, intentionality, and dapat ma-follow up yun dun sa actions nila. And then fair trade, which actually both of these boil down to respeto sa mga farmer. Kasi nung nabanggit mo yung like farmers getting parang the smallest portion of the sale of rice, yun nga lang fast food na extra rice, halos 40 pesos na yung isang cup eh. If you think that's 100 grams of, no? So parang mahal pa sa isang kilo yung sinaing lang nila yung bigas, binalot ng wax paper na may logo, nabenta na nila sa presyo ng mahigit isang kilo yung what is more or less 100 grams. And that is medyo an insult nga that they just sell their rice for 7 pesos, and minsan pati yung government may mandated sila na prices if they would buy the rice, and medyo masakit sa puso. And I also thank you for mentioning yung food miles. Although I did get to watch something na nagsasabi na hindi porket gawa locally is automatically yung carbon footprint niya is less than made from a farther area. Pero logically, of course, when you're doing pretty much the same process, adding shipping of maybe 1,000 kilometers or so really does add up to the food miles, which translates to yung pagpapabilis ng ating climate change. And yes, again, thank you for telling us na it really is about environmental sustainability, since probably yung nagiging punto de vista ng ibang mga government is trade, pera. But when you factor in yung cost ng climate deterioration ng dahil sa pagpapabarko ng mga commodities back and forth, so parang hindi mo mabibili ng pera yung climate eh. And hopefully, yun nga, I guess I just want to end with the note that you said na yung feasibility is there, but it's a matter of is it needed, and sabi mo nga the answer is a resounding yes. Ikaw naman, Jen, ano naman ang mga napulot mo dito sa ating short but sweet exchanges ng kuro-kuro with Mel?
Ayan, sige. Alam mo, marami akong naalala kasi nga, di ba, farmer ang lola ko. Yeah. So, sige, magkukwento ako para may parang pa-anecdote tayong nagaganap. Charing. So, nung bata ako, pagka nagbabakasyon kami doon sa Leyte, di ba, eastern part ng Pilipinas, yung region na yan ay isa sa pinaka mahirap na region. Tapos marami dyan ay mga farmers, fishermen, ganyan. So, meron silang galingan ng bigas, miller, tapos nagtatanim din sila. So, yung sinasabi ni Mel na short value chain, nakita ko talaga yon. Tapos yung mga indigenous best practices or yung mga na-pass down na knowledge. Ayan, nakita ko talaga siya. Kasi yung isang farmer, kaya yung lola ko, hindi lang siya may taniman ng palay, tapos may gilingan ng bigas, tapos parang communal na gilingan yun. So doon nagpapagiling ng bigas yung mga iba din na pumani, 'di ba? Kasi kung mahaba yung value chain, mapapamahal pa yung bigas na inanim mo, pinagiling mo lang ng ganito, tapos ito lang yung nakuha mo, yung kinita mo from that. Pero kung ikaw din yung magko-consume nun, nakigiling ka lang doon, 'di ba? Parang mas may value pa nga yung ganun kasi 'di ba ikaw yung magko-consume. Tapos yung pinagilingan ng bigas, may maliit na babuyan yung lola ko, pinapakain yun sa baboy. Tapos meron din siyang mga bibe. Yung mga bibe sa umaga pupunta yun doon sa rice fields, kakainin yung mga kuhol, 'di ba? So parang yun yung pang pest control nila, 'di ba? Tapos syempre kukunin mo yung mga itlog, may almusal ka na, nagiling ka ng bigas, meron kang kanin. 'Di ba? Ganun. Ganun kasi yung ibang mga communities. So, parang yung mga small-scale farmers, maabilidad talaga sila. Alam nilang mamuhay, 'di ba? Sa ganyang kasimple. Tapos hindi sila yung, kasi karamihan ng mga farmers sa Pilipinas, small-scale. So, siguro, imagine niyo may mga ganyang version din yung ibang mga farmers. Pero yun nga, yung binibili, yung lupain nila, it's either i-convert to mga subdivisions or parang yung mga malalaking farm owners na rin yung nakikinabang, nababago din yung lifestyle. So, ano yung impact nun sa society, 'di ba? Makikita mo yun sa maliit pa lang, yung ganun, communal na mga pamumuhay ng mga tao. Tapos, ito nga, yung sa rice self-sufficiency. So, ako, I'm really hoping na, kasi yung, hindi ko alam kung gaano ka-familiar yung typical Filipino sa totoong plight at saka yung lifestyle ng mga small farmers. Na ako, nakita ko siya, kahit na nagbabakasyon lang ako dun sa probinsya ng lola ko. Nakita ko, na-appreciate mo yung kasimplihan ng gano'n. Kaya, nung nabanggit niya yung tungkol sa sa climate change, parang yung naisip ko doon, nung COP15, pinag-usapan yung climate change reparation, climate reparation. Yan. So magbabayad na yung mga, parang pinag-uusapan na magbayad na ang mga big polluters na mga countries sa mga katulad natin, 'di ba? Mga hindi naman ganoon, pero sobrang apektado. Pero sino ba yung pinaka-apektado ng pagbabagyo or climate change? Unang-una na dyan yung mga farmers, 'di ba? Tutumba yung mga palay nila and all. So pati yung mga ganun kasi na parang ipasok mo pa sa equation yung mga challenges to achieve rice self-sufficiency, yung climate change and everything na year in, year out, pinagdadaanan to ng mga farmers sa Pilipinas. Silang farmers yung umiiyak sa ganyan. Aani na sila, natumba pa yung mga di ba? So parang pagtuunan din natin, kung talagang magbabayad yung mga yan, sana naman na makinabang talaga ay yung mga farmers na yon na naapektuhan. Kasi if walang in place na mga bagay para ma-ensure na sila yung nakikinabang, naku, baka makulimbat lang yan, di ba? So parang maging din sana, maging fair, sila talaga yung makinabang. And siguro lastly, hindi ko akalain na pag sinabi natin rice self-sufficiency is ganito siya kakomplikado na bagay. Kasi parang sa Pilipinas, nasabi mo din to noon, Mel, na parang basta may kanin ako, masaya na ako, di ba? Parang ganon yung mentality ng mga Pinoy. Ganon ka-importante sa atin. So, sana lahat ng Pilipino maintindihan na, oo, kanin lang yan, kahit asin lang yung katabi mo o toyo. Ganyan yung kahalaga. Kasi pag wala yan, parang yung buong identity mo as Pinoy, parang nawala kapag walang kanin, pag walang sinain.
Yeah, it's so true what you said. In terms of parting words, I'd like to pick up, Jen, on what you said regarding the COP. And while food security, unlike the previous one, has now been a topic of the COP, of the recent COP, we need to look into the fact that local self-sufficiency in small-scale food production, although discussed on the side, are not necessarily included in the main agenda or in the main declaration of the COP. So I'd like to part by saying that given the socio-cultural and historical significance, its impact to social and political stability, and its implications to the environment, whether it's the capacity of the resource-rich Philippines to produce its own food and its vulnerability to climate change. The future plate of the Philippines should be rice and perhaps food in general, self-sufficiency.
Okay, thank you for listening and see you in our next episode. Until then, goodbye.
Bye!
For more content and to engage with us, like our Facebook page, Future Plate Podcast,
Or join our Facebook group, Future Plate Collective.
and also follow us on Instagram at Future Plate Podcast.
Stay tuned!